Our food choices have a significant impact on the planet, from fish to meat, from exotic fruit to chocolate and coffee. In this video, we will present emissions coming from animal agriculture. Animal agriculture is responsible for the emissions of 40% of total anthropogenic methane emissions, 65% of total anthropogenic nitrous oxide emissions, and CO2, whose percentage is harder to calculate based on activities considered under the term animal agriculture. What is striking is the fact that the greenhouse gases emitted by animal agriculture are much more warming than CO2. Namely, methane is about 130 times more warming than CO2 over a 10-year time frame. Instead, nitrous oxide is 289 times more warming than CO2 over a 20-year time frame. This is due to the fact that their molecules move at different speeds when receiving solar radiation. CO2 molecules move less in response to radiation. Instead, methane and nitrous oxide ones move extremely fast, thus creating much more heat. Let us now analyze the various sources of emissions, from the most intuitive ones to the indirect ones. Let's take a look at a cow. A cow is a ruminant. It digests rough plant material in a process called enteric fermentation. This process creates methane as a byproduct, which gets emitted into the atmosphere through the cow burping and fart. After food has been processed by the cow, it eventually comes out of the animal in the form of manure. Manure has two chemical components that potentially lead to emissions during storage and processing. Organic compound, which gets converted into methane through anaerobic decomposition, and nitrogen, which releases ammonia into the atmosphere and eventually gets transformed into nitrous oxide. Yet, on the planet, we have more than just one cow. Precisely, 1.5 billion cattle are estimated to be living on the planet. In addition to 22.8 billion chickens, 1.2 billion sheep, 1.2 billion ducks, 1 billion goats, and 967 million pigs. Today, 30% of the available land is used for livestock. And it has been necessary to get rid of some natural habitats to find space for all of these animals. During this process, trees may get burnt, emitting CO2, and soil gets oxidized, emitting CO2 as well. It is also worth considering the opportunity cost of losing such lands. In fact, soil loses its potential to store CO2, as well as burnt trees which cannot absorb CO2 anymore from the atmosphere. The same happens to lands created for crops in order to produce food for so many animals. In fact, huge quantities of soy and rice need to be produced with an exponential increase in the space needed for crops. At the same time, while producing rice in wet fields, the water blocks oxygen from penetrating the soil, which gives room for bacteria to grow, and these bacteria emit further methane. In order to effectively produce that amount of food, many fertilizers are needed. They are usually produced using fossil fuels, and one of the main components of fertilizers is nitrogen, responsible for further emissions of nitrous oxide when used in the production of food for livestock. Yet, we have to consider that food has to be transported and processed for animals to be fed, and further emissions of CO2 come from these processes. Finally, when the animals have been fed and grazed, it is possible to slaughter them and produce food for humans. Yet, flesh needs to be processed, transported, and constantly refrigerated, thus emitting further CO2 emissions. To conclude, let's not forget that to run a farm, a lot of energy is needed. And unless that comes from renewables, its production will be responsible for further CO2 emissions. We have discovered that emissions are attributable to many more factors than just cow's farts as we may think. Manure management, oxidation of soil and deforestation, fertilizers production and usage, transportation and processing of feed and flesh, as well as energy for farms, all contribute to the emissions of greenhouse gases. Plus, we should not forget that the opportunity cost of lost lands due to crops and grazing livestock is an important factor as well, especially for the lost potential to absorb CO2 by soil and trees. Yet, emissions are just part of the story. Many other issues come from animal agriculture, and they are all interconnected. Deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and ocean acidification, to name just some of them. We hope this video has been fun to watch and intuitive enough to make you more conscious about your food choices.